Thank you very much, Angela, and thank you all for being here and for your support of the Field Museum. It means a lot to us, and we deeply appreciate it. The chocolate exhibit means a lot to me because when I first came to the museum in 1999, it was the first exhibit, the first incantation of this exhibit that I worked on as a curator. I co-curated the original chocolate exhibit with Jonathan Haas. It opened in 2002, and it was so popular that we have it again. And when it came back, I have curated it this time around. The question that many of you might wonder is, why did it come back? And the answer is really you, our members, because over the years, during members' nights and on other occasions, people would come to our exhibition staff and they'd say, wow, when are you going to bring that chocolate exhibit back? And enough people did that, and we had a time slot this fall, and so we decided, sure, why not? Let's bring it back, update it, and have it here again. Now, you may wonder, where was it between 2002 and 2011? And the answer to that question is the exhibit was traveling around the United States. 22 different venues, 22 different science centers and museums, from the American Museum in New York to Honolulu at the Bishop Museum. And when chocolate finishes here, it will become an international exhibit. It will go on to Toronto, and my understanding is we just signed a contract with a company in Japan to put on the chocolate exhibit in Japan in Japanese, and they will be doing a version of the exhibit there. So this has been a hugely popular exhibit. We hope it continues to travel even beyond its second time here at the field. Now, don't be afraid. I know that the popularity of the exhibit has nothing to do with me, nor the popularity of today's lecture. I know that that's all chocolate, and you're here because you want to know more about chocolate. And chocolate really is one of the best known foods that few people really know much about. And so when we think about chocolate, we think about, why has this exhibit been so popular? Why has it been traveling for about a decade? What made it so popular? Can we do it again? Can we get something of equal value, equal popularity? And so I think part of the answer is just chocolate itself. There's very few things that are like chocolate. But in addition, there's more to it. And I think there are two things that really have helped us with this exhibition. One is, because chocolate is such a popular food that few know much about, people are interested in the story. And the truth is that chocolate has just a fascinating history, a history that goes deep back into time, which as an archaeologist, I love that. But also, in addition, it's a global story. And so most of that story, chocolate was not even consumed as cake, ice cream, candy. It was consumed as a drink. And a lot of people are still learning that and finding out more about it. Also, chocolate comes from a tree. It comes from a tree, and it comes from the seeds of a football-shaped pod. And a lot of people don't know that. So part of the romance of this exhibit is that it helps us answer some pretty interesting questions, like, where does chocolate come from? Where was it first consumed? Did you know that it began as a drink? Were you aware that it was once used as a currency, so that money really did once grow on trees? How and where did it become a candy? Did you know that much of the chocolate today is grown in places where it's barely eaten at all? So that's all part of the story, and it's a global story, and it's a deep historical story. And the exhibit helps us capture that history, and I think that's part of the popularity of the exhibit. But I think the other part of the popularity of the exhibit is a part that I didn't really think of when I was working on this the first time around. And that is that chocolate is such an important part of our culture today. It's really a key aspect of our memories. It's part of our holidays, Valentine's Day and Easter and Christmas and Hanukkah and Day of the Dead and Halloween. It's part of our rituals that we share with our family and friends. And so we all have, in a sense, a special place in our brain for chocolate. But what this exhibit does, beyond revive our own personal memories and personal warm feelings about chocolate, what it does beyond that is it helps share the meaning of chocolate that other people who share the globe with us have. It helps tell the story of others and how they have used chocolate and what chocolate means to them, thereby enriching our own personal memories and helping us see the importance of this food in a much wider perspective. And I'll just share with you one story from my own recent history where I got to see how important chocolate, cacao was to people who are dear to me. Now, as I said, I am the curator of Mesoamerican and Central American anthropology here at the field, and I wear many hats. I don't just advise on exhibits. I also have the great opportunity to do my own field work in Mexico, and I work with my wife, Linda, who's here with us today as well. And my work is here in the Valley of Oaxaca, very close to the site of Mitla in the eastern arm of the Valley of Oaxaca. And a lot of our story today for chocolate is a story focused on Mesoamerica, the Central Highlands, the homeland of the Aztec and their capital Tenochtitlan, and particularly the Maya region as well as Oaxaca. So just sort of locate ourselves here in one of the areas that we'll be focusing on. But in my recent work, the last several years, I've been excavating at a site known as the Mitla Fortress, about 3 kilometers from the community of an archaeological zone of Mitla in the Valley of Oaxaca, about 35 kilometers from Oaxaca City and Monte Alban. Some of you may have been to the Valley of Oaxaca and Oaxaca City. And what we're doing there is we're excavating pre-Hispanic houses at this site, trying to learn about how people lived, what they did for a living, what the economy was like, how they were interacting with Monte Alban and other parts of the valley. And the Mitla Fortress, though we're not excavating near the top, but near the top there's some fabulous ruins, including these defensive walls, which are pre-Hispanic in date. And also inside the walls, there are some adobe palaces, and these pre-Hispanic walls of the palaces are still standing. The Mitla Fortress, I feel very lucky to work there because actually the very first curator of the Field Museum, William Henry Holmes, actually visited the Mitla Fortress and wrote about it in the first publication of the Field Museum. It was called the Columbian Exposition Museum at that time, but he wrote about and visited the Mitla Fortress, and now we have the great privilege of working there. And if you notice, this is not just an archaeological site, and you can barely see it here, but this little white speck here is a cross, because the Mitla Fortress today is a contemporary Catholic shrine that the people who live in Mitla and the vicinity visit on pilgrimages once a year, but also other times to make special prayers to God for things that they need or want. And so recently, last year, we were visiting the shrine at the top of the hill and talking to some people. And we noticed that at the shrine, people had left little packets of paper and with flowers, and inside these packets there are cacao seeds. And so cacao has this special meaning, so important that when people want to make an offering to God, they leave the cacao. So we knew that cacao was important to people in this area, to our friends, and every time we were invited to a baptism or a wedding, you always are served hot chocolate as a very early part of the meal. But this was a new thing that we learned, is that was left in offerings. And then when we visited a shrine in the town of Mitla, on the top of an archaeological ruin again, we found that people had left cacao beans with candles. So this is what I mean, that what cacao and chocolate mean to different people is really different in different parts of the world, and it really is interesting and touching to see the different uses of this plant and how important its role is in many cultures. Where does this story begin? The story begins in the land near the equator. This is the area where you can grow the cacao plant. The cacao comes from a tree. It comes from the pods that grow on the cacao tree. The pods are relatively low down on the plant, and it grows in rainforests in the equatorial zone. And it's a plant that requires not only a good amount of rain, but it also requires the shade from the different levels of canopies that protect the cacao tree from heavier rain and wind. And it's the canopies that protect it in the multi-tiered rainforest. So this is the zone where cacao can grow. Now, very recent research, even more recent than our exhibit, suggests that the real origin for the plant was probably in the Amazon in northern South America. The new genetic work is now telling us that. But what's interesting is that culturally we don't have that much evidence of people in that area consuming cacao. We have some that they were consuming at the time the Spanish arrived, but we don't know much about its history there or its importance there. But what we do know is very early on, the seeds of this plant must have been traded north into Central America and eventually into southern Mexico, and particularly along the Pacific coast. And it's from the Pacific coast of Mesoamerica that we have the earliest archaeological evidence for the consumption of cacao, going back more than 3,000 years. Now, a key part of the cacao plant are these flowers, and it's when these flowers are pollinated that they become these pods. And it's inside these pods that we have the beans or the seeds, which are processed to give us cacao, the key ingredient in chocolate. Cacao is scientifically Theobroma cacao. The cacao part of it comes from the Maya word for this plant and this drink. The Theobroma was given by the great botanist and taxonomist Linnaeus much later in the 17th century, and Linnaeus gave it the name Theobroma, which means food of the gods. So that shows the importance that it took on for Europeans at the time of the scientific naming of all the plants around the world. The cacao tree is more than its pods, though. It depends on the flowers, of course, to give us the pods. It depends on the leaves, which are part of what nourishes the plant when they fall to the ground. And it depends on the roots, of course, which bring the water and the nutrients to the tree and to the growing cacao pods. So it takes the whole plant to give us the seed. And it's a plant that cannot be grown in great density. It needs some spacing for the nutrients that feed it. It's not it's not like corn like we see growing here in Illinois, where the fields are stacked with many, many plants close together. No, you have to space out this tree and give it some room. A key part of the whole process is this little midge. And this is such a key part. This little fly-like midge is important because it pollinates the flowers. Cacao is not pollinated by bees or some of the other insects, birds that pollinate other flowers. It's pollinated by the midge. And the midge grows in the leaf debris at the base of the tree. And then it doesn't have very far to move up the tree stalk, up the tree trunk to pollinate these flowers, making way then for the pods. Now, people ask, where does chocolate come from? It comes from right here. It comes from these seeds inside the pod, and then the pulp that is around the seeds also has the taste of chocolate. And the interesting thing is the seeds themselves are quite bitter. Some of you have had pure chocolate or pure cacao. Know that the without sugar, without honey, it's a very bitter taste. And the seeds have that taste. And that's part of its survival mechanism, because it's not, the seeds, if they were very sweet, might be totally consumed by animals and birds, and they would never be dispersed to reproduce. But because they're not so tasty to the animals will maybe swallow them, but not chew them up, and then they'll get rid of them, and that helps spread the plant. It's through that mechanism. Or they're left on the ground and kicked around and moved around by natural processes, again, helping to spread the plant. Also, humans have spread the plant, and we know they did this very early on from the archaeological data that we have, and I'll talk about momentarily. So the seeds are naturally bitter. The pulp around the seeds is a little sweeter, but it's the seeds that primarily were used to make the foods that are so dear to us. So how do we know that the consumption of cacao goes back more than 3,000 years in Mesoamerica? We know through some very innovative work studying the residues inside ceramic vessels that were found during archaeological excavations. And this pot right here is about 3,500 years old. It was found in the Mexican state of Chiapas on the Pacific coast of that country. And the scrapings from inside of this vessel, the residues from inside of this vessel were tested, and they revealed the chemical theobromine, which is a pretty rare chemical discrete to the chocolate plant. And when this chemical was found on this vessel, we knew that this particular vessel was used to consume cacao as a drink. This pot here was actually the first vessel that was ever tested for this kind of residue analysis. It's a bit more recent. It comes from the first millennium AD, or the classic period, in the Maya area, in the Petén in Guatemala. And this pot also revealed the residues of the theobromine chemical for cacao. And interestingly enough, this particular vessel also contains glyphs that say it was the chocolate pot of a specific Maya lord. So the fact that they found the residues of cacao inside is pretty neat and confirms how it was used. But you can see by the nature of those vessels that it was a drink in this time. And that's how it was first consumed, and that's how we know it goes back more than 3,000 years. I won't go into all the complex processes, but basically the residues from inside these vessels are fed into different kinds of chemical analytical techniques, mass spectrometer, and also chromatography. And by looking at the residues and the composition of those residues, you get output that tells you the different compositions of those chemicals that are in the residues, and that's how you identify the chemicals that are part of cacao inside these vessels. Here we see again the early chocolate pot that was studied from the Maya area. And during these early times, most of our evidence from cacao use in the period between about 1500 BC and the first centuries AD, most of the cacao use comes from lowland Mesoamerica, lowland Guatemala, Mexico, Chiapas, those parts of the Mesoamerican world. But by the time we get to the later classic period, after about 500 AD, we start seeing that cacao, although grown in the backyard of the Maya, this is a Maya vase, a polychrome vase of the classic Maya, rolled out to have a scene, and you see that it depicts the cacao tree here as part of the scene, with a lord with a very fancy feathered headdress. And so that cacao was now being still grown near where the Maya lived, but its connection with people of higher status was beginning to become more of a reality. It wasn't so much something that everybody consumed, but it was now becoming a little bit more restricted to those of high status. How was it consumed? It was consumed as a drink, and you see here a consort pouring a liquid into another vase. These vase-shaped vessels are generally associated with cacao. And why was it being poured from one vase to another? It was done. They did that because the most valued part of the drink was the foam that was created when you agitated this liquid. And so one of the ways that you got the foam was by pouring it back and forth from one vessel to another, kind of make it fizzy. And so here you see it as part of a ritual preparing the cacao. Now, we know that the Maya mixed their cacao drink with many different other edible foods, including maize flour from corn. They mixed it with vanilla, with chili peppers to give it kind of a spicy, bitter liquid. They also mixed it with honey to give it a sweeter taste. So we know that they prepared it in many different ways, and it seems from the little information we have that different kinds of chocolate drinks were more prevalent in different kinds of ritual occasions. Chocolate drinks, cacao drinks were important enough to the Maya that they had a glyph, or actually several different glyphs for cacao that are part of their writing system. And this glyph is very prominent actually on the pottery of the classic Maya, because so many of the vessels that were highly decorated were the cacao vases of specific Maya lords, and they were identified as such using this glyph. So this was a very, very important food, and the connection between those who could write, the scribes, they often were the relatives of the Lord. So they would be the ones who would identify a vessel as belonging to their cousin or their brother or sister, whatever. We also know that the Maya, this is a little bit later document, codex of the Maya, but we see here that they were leaving cacao seeds as offerings. So not only was this important consumption for rituals, but also cacao seeds were important enough to leave as offerings to the gods, much as we see in the Oaxaca today, leaving the seeds as offerings to the gods. And we see here that it's an important part of ritual events. Here a woman is bringing a vase to a particular individual who's having a meeting with the Lord. Here as well you see the foam. That's a telltale sign of the cacao drink. And again, a higher status lord dealing with somebody of lesser status, less bedecked. And we know that these are lords because they're sitting on a kind of mat. And the Maya referred to their kings and rulers as lords of the mat. And you see that these most powerful, elaborately dressed figures with necklaces and so on are sitting on raised platforms or mats. So chocolate was part of these rituals of elite meetings where lords met with underlings. And as I said, this particular vessel also identifies it as a particular ruler's chocolate pot. This vessel is at the Logan Museum on the Beloit campus. If you ever get up to southern Wisconsin, that's where it is, but it includes the glyph for cacao. Well, by the time we get to the latter part of the first millennium AD, after about 500 AD, we know that chocolate, cacao had spread across Mesoamerica to other Mesoamerican cultures, and that its connection as a drink associated with people of high status was becoming tighter and tighter in these areas, because in these areas you could not grow the cacao plant right in your backyard as the Maya could. You had to import the seeds from quite far away. And this particular document is a Mixtec codex. It's done on paper. It's from the part of the state of Oaxaca, and you see two lords, again, very highly bedecked lords, who are consuming cacao, again in a vase-like vessel with foam on top as part of an important meeting. So this tells us again that by later pre-Hispanic times in Mexico, cacao was widespread. It was consumed as a very important food outside of the area where it could be produced, and that it was of significant meaning and value. By the 1400s and the beginnings of the Aztec Empire, cacao had spread all across Mesoamerica, and as I'll mention, even up to the southwestern U.S., and cacao was so valuable to the rulers of the Aztec that Montezuma II, one of the emperors of the Aztecs, actually had his cacao run up from Veracruz every single day because he wanted fresh cacao. Now remember, this is a civilization that did not have beasts of burden. So everything had to move around, especially in inland areas, by foot. And so runners carried the cacao up from Veracruz to central Mexico so that the ruler could drink his fresh cacao. Cacao was widely traded at this time. The seeds were widely traded by the Pochteca, or the traders who carried loads using the tump line. And you see the packets of goods that they carried. And again, this included the valuable cacao seeds. And they often also were taken as part of tribute. When the Aztec conquered a province in another part of Mexico, they would demand certain goods from the local peoples, things that they may not be able to get in central Mexico. And one of those goods was cacao seeds. And you see that many of the goods that they asked for are things that you could not find in central Mexico: tropical bird feathers, jaguar and ocelot pelts, different kinds of goods that are not really typical of highland Mexico, but are very, very typical of lowland Mexico. But one of those was the cacao. And it's at this time that cacao was not only used to make a drink, but it also, as I said, was a currency. The importance to the Aztec is interesting because they couldn't grow it. And here you see an Aztec sculpture of somebody holding a cacao pot, and it's the tree as part of an Aztec codice in a meeting of lords. And what's interesting here is that we're seeing the story of cacao is really a story of a commodity. And the process, something that started out being grown locally, consumed locally, but that through time it was traded, it became highly valued, it became limited to a certain group of people who controlled access to it. And this process of chocolate becoming a commodity actually began well before it was introduced to European peoples. The story of it becoming a commodity is one that we see pretty clearly in pre-Hispanic Mexico. So these give you an idea of its importance, even though they could not grow it in their homeland. As I mentioned, this is when chocolate grew on trees. Money grew on trees, and so we see the cacao bean was one of the currencies, along with copper axes and cloth mantas that were used to facilitate exchange in the Aztec market. We have enough information to know that there were fairly stable valuations, not completely stable, but somewhat stable. 1 cacao bean to 5 chilies, 30 cacao beans to 1 small rabbit, 20 for a small trip by a porter, 65 for a plain white cape, and 300 or more for a very fine woven cotton cape. So this was a currency that was a key to the exchange system of the Aztec. Many people don't know that the Aztec had a highly vibrant market. The Spanish conquerors who came from the Mediterranean Sea area, which was the hotbed of European commerce in the 1500s, and yet when they came to Mexico, they just gush over the market system. They say, we have never seen a market as large or as vibrant as the Tlatelolco market at the center of the Aztec Empire. And they talk about the range of goods that were sold there. And this is interesting because many times people think, oh, market economies, they're just simply something that Europeans had. No, actually the market in Mesoamerican societies was very highly developed. And not only did they have the market, but in addition, they must have had some kind of concern with profit or making a good deal, because as you see from this quote, the Spanish recorded that the certain vendors counterfeited cacao beans by putting in amaranth dough or wax or other things as trying to imitate cacao seeds, and so they were trying to take advantage of the people who they were trading with. Well, even before Aztec times, we now know through very, very recent research in the last couple of years that cacao was traded up to the Southwest. For a long, long time, people wondered about these vases in the Southwest. There are only about 200 of these vessels that have been found complete in all the excavations in the U.S. Southwest, New Mexico and Arizona. And about 160-something of these vessels come from Chaco Canyon site in New Mexico, which is a very large site in New Mexico dating between about 1000 AD and around 1200 AD. And so many of these vessels come from Chaco Canyon. Most of those come from one particular pueblo building at Chaco Canyon, Pueblo Bonito. And people have wondered, well, there's no antecedent to these ceramic forms in the Southwest. Where did they come from? So in several recent studies, people decided to test the residues inside these jars. And what they found is that, again, the residues included theobromine, so that these vases were used to drink chocolate. And it's very similar to the forms that we saw for the Maya region. And we know that they could not have grown the cacao tree in very arid New Mexico. Rather, it's very likely that the seeds were traded all the way up from central Mexico to Chaco Canyon, where they were consumed in very similar formed vases as were used in Mesoamerica, but that were clearly done in local Southwest style. This is very typical style painting for the New Mexico area. And we are very lucky here at the Field Museum in that we have a number of these vases that are on display in our Ancient Americas exhibit. And next time you have a chance to see that exhibit, I urge you to go there and look under the Chaco Canyon collection and check out some of these vases. Well, in the 16th century, the Spanish conquerors came over and they conquered the people of Mexico. And Cortez was one of the first, not the first, but was one of the first Spanish to be served chocolate. He was served it by Montezuma because Montezuma thought he was a foreign lord and so was treating him appropriately. But at first Cortez found it very bitter and he didn't like it at all. But it didn't take very long for him to realize that this drink had some special properties. And you see some of the Spanish talking about how maybe there's some use for this drink. It doesn't taste so good, but it kind of picks me up. Because cacao has caffeine in it, so they talk about how it sort of wiped away the fatigue or made them more able to march farther or fight better. And so pretty quickly on, Cortez writes back to King Charles in Spain and says, maybe we have something here. I'm going to send some of these seeds back on the next boat and see what you can, see what you think about it, see what you can do with it. So he came looking for gold, but instead he found cacao, found chocolate. I said Cortez probably was not the first one to try it because actually one of Columbus's sons talks about cacao seeds when on one of their later visits to the Caribbean, they came across a large canoe that was a trading canoe operating along the coast of Yucatan and into the Caribbean, and he observed the people on this boat and he saw them drop the almond-like cacao seeds. And people would scoop down and pick them up, much like if you dropped your coins when you're trying to put coins in a parking meter, and everybody picked up every last bean because these were valuable not just for food, but also because they were a kind of currency. So the Spanish were intrigued by this plant and the seeds, and they sent it back with them to Spain. This was part of what's called the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange, when many foods that were domesticated and utilized in the Americas were sent back to Europe, and these included corn, potatoes from South America, corn from Mexico, tomatoes, chilies, avocados, vanilla, cacao, and other plants as well. And think about how important these foods were to the European world and what has happened in the European world over the last centuries. Think about Ireland without potatoes, Russian and Central European food without the potato, or Italian food without the tomato. That's what it was like before the 16th century. All of these foods came from the Americas and were brought back to Europe by people from that part of the world. Well, when cacao came to Europe, it was quickly combined with sugar. It remained a drink, and the Spanish held on to these cacao seeds. They really monitored them closely. They wanted to keep a kind of monopoly on cacao, but they wanted to consume it because it was thought to have a connection with vitality and perhaps giving them a caffeine kind of up. And so they combined it with sugar, and they would drink cacao at chocolate houses. And in fact, in Europe, cacao houses preceded coffee houses in Southern Europe. And it was, as I said, at first limited to primarily Southern Europe. But in Europe in this time, there were dynasties, and the dynasties crossed country barriers or principalities, like the Habsburg, who controlled Austria and Spain. And it was through these elite interactions and elite dynasties, often that crossed bounds, that slowly cacao was introduced to other parts of Europe. It remained very much connected to the elite, was something not distributed to everybody in these countries. It was primarily associated with dukes and duchesses who would consume it in chocolate houses on very fancy porcelain. and that would require an entry fee to enter these houses where there's sort of elite gossip. And in a sense, it's not that different from the rituals of the pre-Hispanic lords who would meet and consume cacao as part of their events, as we saw in the Codex Nuttall. So this was chocolate's early use, but in the 16 and 1700s, it was mostly consumed in these chocolate houses, but it started to spread throughout Europe. And even though it still had this elite connection, by the time it gets to the late 1700s and makes its way into Northern Europe, that was a time of revolution. We know, of course, of the American Revolution, but there was also French Revolution and other revolutions in Europe. And with these revolutions, there was a desire for people beyond the kings and queens to have a chance to consume this drink and consume cacao. And so we start to see, as chocolate makes its entry into Northern Europe, that there is demand, a growing demand, to find ways to bring it to more people. Now, of course, this is not only a sweet story, because once chocolate becomes tightly bound up with sugar, that sugar was produced primarily through slave labor in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And so the story of chocolate has its very sad and difficult parts because these were so wound up, and millions of people went into the production of this sugar in the Caribbean so that these chocolate houses throughout much of Europe could continue to serve this highly valued drink. Well, once in Northern Europe, and once we went through this period of revolution, things really began to change quickly. And we see the beginning of many innovations that help to, in a sense, democratize or make chocolate more a good of mass production, more so like mass consumption, mass production. And there are a whole series of innovations that allowed this to happen. Most of them beginning in the late 1700s and continuing through the 1800s. And these were the things that led to the processing of chocolate through a whole series of steps. Many of these innovations occurred in Northern Europe. In fact, most of them occurred either in Netherlands, in England, or in Switzerland. And some of the steps, these are not even all the steps, but you had the addition of sugar in Southern Europe was a key step. Chocolate houses began to shift the access and demand, and also the elite interactions across Europe spread the drink to a wider part of Europe. But then the Dutch, Van Houten's extraction of cocoa powder by separating the butter from the liquor, then treating the cacao with an alkalizing agent to moderate the flavor and make it less bitter, but also, very importantly, making it easier to mix. This is all laying the groundwork for chocolate as we know it as candy. In 1847, we see the reblending of the powder with the cacao butter to actually make a paste by Fry's in England, and this is where we get the first candy bars from 1847. Later, as part of the step of widening the distribution, the Swiss chemist Nestle helps add milk to chocolate, making milk chocolate. And of course, milk is cheaper than cacao, so in 1879, you can even make it more widely distributed because it becomes less expensive to produce. And finally, the mechanization of the process with steam powder to grind the chocolate. All of these were very, very key steps in the process, and all of these still are kind of mimicked today with what goes on in the production of our candy bars. You see here an early factory where it was midway in the process, in that some of the mechanized equipment is used to grind and work the chocolate, but still a lot of the work is done by hand, done by humans, putting it into paste and shaping it. And you see the amount of labor that was involved. And I spoke to somebody from Kraft at an event and Cadbury, and all of these steps today are done pretty much without any human labor. So it's the same process, but you don't have any actual hands working the production of chocolate. This is some of the chocolate produced by Fries, and as I said earlier, milk kind of changed the equation because all of a sudden it became much cheaper to produce and easier to mold as well. And it was the use of the condensed milk by Fries that really spread this across England and Europe, and the process was adapted by many companies over the entire continent. Here you see one of the first labels of a chocolate bar from 1847 from Fry's. Mr. Fry had 5 boys, so he named his candy bar after his sons. Another key step was the making of molds, and this was part of the marketing process for chocolate. This is a gentleman, Mr. Strohecker. He's the father of the Easter Bunny, who in the very late 1800s was responsible for some of the first molds of chocolate for holidays. And you see that it's used for many, many holidays, Greek Orthodox holidays and Christian holidays, and used for Hanukkah. So the mold sort of made that possible. But there's interesting about this time, there's another connection to the Field Museum. Some of you may know that in 1893, there was the World Columbian Exposition here in Chicago. And that exposition was the beginning of the Field Museum because we got many of our collections from the exhibits at that fair. But another thing that happened there was some German entrepreneurs, some German candy makers, brought their chocolate press to the Columbian Exposition. And lo and behold, who saw the chocolate press there but Milton Hershey? And he was fascinated by it. He bought it, and he used it to establish a small chocolate factory in Pennsylvania. Well, we know the rest of the story there, and it was really the beginnings of the mass production and consumption of chocolate in the United States. All began with the Columbian Exposition. Well, once we have chocolate candy and it meeting broad audiences, we really see the marketing of the allure of chocolate and its connection with romance and Valentine's Day. Long ago, as I said, there's been the idea that chocolate might somehow give you vitality, and the story goes that Casanova liked to consume chocolate before he would have his little trysts or whatever you want, liaisons. But there may be some basis for that connection because chocolate does include a chemical, phenylethylamine, which is a chemical that the brain produces when one is in love. So there may be a connection there, and so the link to romance and the marketing of it as part of this romance may have some chemical basis. It also was connected to war, the idea that our soldiers in both World War I and World War II deserved and warranted their chocolate. And in the First World War, there was actually a fund to help send chocolate rations to doughboys from the United States as they fought battles in Europe. In World War II, chocolate was rationed and sent by the English to their soldiers and sailors who were fighting World War II. So not only was chocolate connected with love, it was also connected to something that soldiers and we needed for war to protect the homeland. Today, chocolate is really a worldwide commodity traded on the commercial exchanges around the world. Its production is very, very mechanized and involves many, many people. As I hinted at the start, chocolate production today is greatest in West Africa, a region where it has little history and where people do not consume it in any kind of regular way, but it's West African countries that produce the bulk of the world's chocolate. Now, this is not always an easy story. As some of you may know, that some of the chocolate production in West Africa is done by child labor. Some of it's involved less than great working conditions. This is something that we raised in the chocolate exhibit during its initial show here in 2002. I think it helped to shine a little light on the issue and may have been a small factor in some of the improvements that have been made in chocolate production in this part of the world, although there are still issues in its production. And one of the things that makes it hard is because much of the chocolate is produced on very small farms and plantations, and so when it's bulked in larger cities, you don't always know where particular beans came from. So you don't, even if you wanted to just buy from farmers who had good working conditions, it would be a bit hard to do. But nevertheless, there have been some moves by government and farmers to make it both more sustainable and somewhat fair to those who produce it. What can you do? You can look out for chocolate that has the Fairtrade symbol on it. There's some where from the Rainforest Alliance and the Fairtrade symbol where they make sure that the chocolate is produced under appropriate conditions. And we have some of that in our store here at the museum following the exhibit. So, I have a couple of questions. Some of them come right out of the talk. Others require a bit of additional knowledge, but you can find that knowledge in the exhibit. And so the first question, this one's the easiest one. Cacao originated in the Americas, but which country grows the most cacao today? Does anybody want to hazard a guess? Ivory Coast, that's right. Excellent. Very well done. That's perfect. Great. Thank you. What about the second question? What country consumes the most chocolate per person? Switzerland. Excellent. You guys are really on top of it. That's great. What about the third question? Which country consumes the highest percentage of the cacao that it grows itself? Brazil, right. And then finally, which country grinds the most cacao for processing? Netherlands, fantastic, perfect. God, you guys were outstanding. I don't know, you must have had a cheat sheet or something. Anyway, thank you for paying attention, and thank you for your support of the museum and the exhibit. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I'll be happy to take a few questions.